Hello, this is sbagne, and I'm talking about public use today. Eminent domain can only be used to accomplish a public versus a private use. What constitutes a public versus a private use is subject to determination and is based upon the language of the Constitution at play. In Michigan, the language of the Constitution was interpreted two vastly different ways in cases ranging from 1981 through 2006. This post is going to take you to the locations of those three cases and explain to you how the definition of public use changed dramatically in Michigan law.
We're here in Detroit on General Motors Boulevard outside the General Motors Factory Zero plant. In 1981, the city of Detroit used eminent domain to assemble the land to build this factory. A group of property owners challenged the taking, asserting that General Motors was the primary beneficiary of the project, therefore there was not a public use. The Michigan Supreme Court disagreed and allowed the taking to proceed. I'm going to read from the opinion, first summarizing the property owner's position. The owners challenged the constitutionality of using the power of eminent domain to condemn one person's property and convey it to another private person in order to bolster the economy. They argued that whatever incidental benefit may accrue to the public, assembling land to General Motors specifications, for conveyance to General Motors, for its uncontrolled use in profit making, is really a taking for a private use and not a public use, because General Motors is the primary beneficiary of the condemnation. The Supreme Court agreed with the city and allowed the condemnation to proceed. I'm going to read again from the opinion. When there is such a public need, the abstract right of an individual to make use of his own property in his own way is compelled to yield to the general comfort and protection of the community and to a proper regard to relative rights in others. Eminent domain is an inherent power of the sovereign of the same nature as, albeit more severe than, the power to regulate the use of land through zoning or the prohibition against public nuisances. In the instant case, the benefit to be received by the municipality invoking the power of eminent domain is a clear and significant one, and is sufficient to satisfy this court that such a project was intended and the legitimate object of the legislature when it allowed municipalities to exercise condemnation powers, even though a private property owner will also ultimately receive a benefit as an incident thereto. Next, we'll go to another location in Wayne County where this law was changed 23 years later. We're in Romulus, south of Metro Airport, to talk about Wayne County versus Hathcock, the case that overruled Poletown. Wayne County had used FAA grants to buy about 500 acres worth of property, but the property was spread out in a checkerboard fashion. Wayne County wanted to buy about another 800 acres, put it all together, and create the Pinnacle Project, which would be an industrial park that would have uses like this Amazon Center that capitalize on proximity to the airport. However, Wayne County was not allowed to proceed because the Michigan Supreme Court overruled Poletown and determined that there was no public use. I'm going to read from the decision. Here are the situations in which the Supreme Court said that public use allowed the transfer of private property to a private entity. Quoting from the opinion now, when our Constitution was ratified in 1963, it was well established in this court's eminent domain jurisprudence that the constitutional public use requirement was not an absolute bar against the transfer of condemned property to private entities. It was equally clear, however, that the constitutional public use requirement worked to prohibit the state from transferring private property for a private use. Thus, the court's eminent domain jurisprudence, at least that portion concerning the reasons for which the state may condemn private property, has focused largely on the area between those poles. Three situations were identified. First, condemnations in which private land was constitutionally transferred by the condemning authority to a private entity involved public necessity of the extreme sort, otherwise impracticable. This meant things like railroads or utilities, in which the improvement basically ran in a straight line from point A to point B. Second, the court found that the transfer of condemned property to a private entity was consistent with the Constitution's public use requirement when the private entity remained accountable to the public in the use of that property. And the Supreme Court cited a pipeline that remains regulated by the state as an example. Finally, condemned land may be transferred to a private entity when the selection of the land to be condemned is itself based on the public concern. This basically involved things like blight removal, where the elimination of the existing use was the public use. None of these standards were met. The Supreme Court recognized that plenty of office parks exist without the use of eminent domain, and that there would be no subsequent regulation of the use once it was transferred to private entities for private profit. As a result, the Supreme Court overruled Poletown and prohibited condemnation for the Pinnacle project. Next, we'll go to Novi, and we'll talk about an opinion issued just a year later that helped clarify the public use requirement. We're near the corner of Novi Road and Grand River, which is extremely congested. The city wanted to build this ring road to help alleviate the traffic congestion. They also wanted to build a spur into a factory that had a dangerous entrance on Grand River. This is the spur road, which basically serves only that factory back there. The property owners challenged the condemnation, asserting that it was for a private use. They focused on the fact that it essentially only served that property owner. However, the Supreme Court chose not to even evaluate the factors in Wayne County versus Hathcock. In a case called City of Novi versus Adell, the Supreme Court ruled that because this was a public road owned by the city, that the public was free to travel, it was a public use. And they disregarded the fact that there was a disproportionate benefit to that property owner, even though that property owner was helping to pay for the road, and there was talk about naming the road after that property owner's company.
The story does not end with those three decisions. At the same time that Michigan was deciding Hathcock and Adell, the United States Supreme Court issued the Kelo decision. The Kelo decision reached the exact opposite conclusion of Hathcock. The type of taking prohibited under the Michigan Constitution in Hathcock is allowed under the federal Constitution. The voters of the state of Michigan were so outraged by the Kelo decision that a ballot initiative took place in 2006. That ballot initiative, among other things, codified the Hathcock holding and limited the ability of agencies to engage in blight removal by imposing a stricter standard for public use. A state is allowed to have a stricter constitution and grant its citizens more rights than the federal constitution allows. Therefore, the Hathcock decision controls takings in the state of Michigan that are exercised by Michigan agencies, while the Kelo decision would govern a taking under the federal